Welcome to Of Knights and Pilgrims, a podcast about Edmund Spenser's A Faerie Queene. I'm Christian Leithart.
I'm David Grubbs.
Today we're discussing Canto 9, the Despair Canto. So this particular canto is near and dear to my heart. The obsession started in high school, believe it or not.
Really?
When we were assigned this. I mean, we read all of book one in high school, and I have thought a lot about why this one jumped out to me. In high school, we read all of book one, and then my friends and I made a short film of this episode, this despair episode, starring me as, I didn't want to be in it. I wanted to be behind the camera, but we didn't have anyone else, so I was Red Cross. And a friend, an exchange student from Thailand, was Despair, and she did some creepy voiceover in Thai.
Ooh.
So no one in the class could understand it. It just sounded like this odd language going on in the background. So it was very atmospheric and everything. And then when I went to grad school, even though I was at a school where there wasn't anyone particularly who was focused on Spenser particularly, I wanted to study Spenser, and I selected this canto. And as I've thought about the reasons for that choice, it kind of comes back to the characters, the Despair character using words as his weapons.
Right.
It's a kind of unusual opponent for Red Cross. There's violence, there's swordplay, jousting, and then he meets this guy who talks to him.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of captured my imagination, that you could have a villain that does nothing but talk to you, and in a way, he's the most dangerous of all. But I suppose we should summarize what happens in this canto. So to refresh your memory, the last canto, the giant is defeated, or Gogol is defeated.
Deflated.
Yes, deflated. Then they ransack the castle, which is mostly empty and ruled over by, not ruled over. The steward is the giant's foster father, who is, his name's Ignaro. He's dumb. He has his head on backwards.
He doesn't know anything about anything.
Yes. Yes, that's right. He's not dumb in the... I meant that he can't speak, but he actually can speak. He can just say one thing. I cannot tell. And then they rescue Red Cross from the dungeon, the pit that he's in. He's very woeful and sad and emaciated. And then they expose Duessa for what she truly is. We finally get to see her in her true form, and she's horrible.
Her hideous witch form.
Yeah, her hideous witch form with the fox's tail and everything. So we start Canto 9. And there's three tales in Canto 9. Prince Arthur, tells his backstory, which he doesn't know a lot about, but he gives some details about it. And then he continues his quest and leaves Una and Red Cross. They encounter a knight named Sir Trevisan, who rides up to them in a panic and then tells them a story about his friend Sir Terwin. And then Red Cross and Una encounter Despair, who tells Red Cross his own story, but with a bit of a spin on it. So you kind of have these three tales here. There's a pretty strong contrast between how Arthur interprets his own story, his own backstory, and how he responds to it, and how Red Cross responds when he hears Despair tell his backstory, and how he responds to it. This canto was a focus of my master's thesis. And as I was reviewing my notes over the weekend, there's the danger of the grad student, the insufferable grad student who won't stop talking about their thesis, or the PhD student.
Oh, man, that's real.
And it's just everything becomes all about that one topic. And we could spend all day, I think, talking about this canto and all the key words and phrases and everything that's used. We'll try to resist that, but there's plenty to say.
Oh, yeah.
It starts with this description of this chain of virtues. Well, what's your take on that, David? The goodly golden chain, wherewith you fear, the virtues linked are and lovely wise.
What Spenser does at the beginning of each canto, almost every canto, is to react poetically to some element of what the last canto ended with. So he'll
previously on the Faerie Queene.
Yeah, exactly. Previously on the Faerie Queene. Except it's not so much this is the action that happened as it is this is the theme that we just saw. And the theme that we just saw is this goodly golden chain, so that virtues are linked, but also noble minds of yore allied were in brave pursuit of chivalrous emprise, that none did others' safety despise, nor aid envy him in need that stands, but friendly each did others' praise devise, how to advance with favorable hands. as this good prince redeemed the Red Cross Knight from bans. So here Spenser is praising the knights of yore for being allied with one another, being friendly to one another, helping each other out, singing each other's praises.
So, and the knights of yore are these guys that we're singing about. He's not referring to an even older.
Yeah.
Not only, I guess, allegorically, not only are their virtues linked to one another, which is a kind of tradition. As you advance in one virtue, you're advancing in all of them. But also the knights are working together.
Yes.
And that's what makes them, that strengthens everyone.
It's that section in the Nicomachean Ethics about friendship, where the truest friendship seeks the good of the friend, sees the good in the friend, and seeks the good for the friend. So that growth in virtue isn't a strong, silent, solo thing, but rather something that takes place in a community with friends, allies, fellow seekers of the good. And so chivalry is being presented as a model of virtuous friendship.
And, I mean, Arthur is almost the epitome of that, not just in this book, but just in the Arthurian myths and legends, that the Round Table is all the knights of King Arthur who they sit all equidistant from each other at the Round Table because the companionship of the knights is significant to who they are.
Arthur is perfect for establishing this theme for exactly that point. Whatever version of the Arthur story, you've got Britons in chaos before Arthur rises. The result of Arthur's coming to power is that those who had previously been rivals, had been at war, are brought together in a fellowship. So, yeah, Spenser's finding, again, in Arthur a very apt tool, not only for the literal adventures that are happening, but also for the themes that he's trying to weave in.
Yeah, and Arthur, he makes this argument explicitly to Una in Canto 7. She rushes up to him in panic and despair, really. She uses the word despair.
Foreshadowing.
When she finds out that her knight's been captured. And he says, basically, do you want to talk about it? And she says, no, it wouldn't do any good. And he says, actually, no, if you speak, you'll share the burdens. And that is what you need to do. And so there is, he's this very, this convivial, being a good comrade is important for what he stands for. He's not the lone hero. So anyway.
Which is interesting because he keeps wandering around by himself, but then no, he's not really by himself. He has his squire.
That's true. I hadn't thought. And in the battle with the giant, he relies on the squire to watch his back, basically. Arthur tells a little bit of his backstory. David knows far more about this than I do and what the differences are here between the kind of the classic Mallory Arthurian backstory and what's here. We get some. Well, the key name is Merlin. He really he plays a part here. Arthur he says he doesn't know his lineage and sire. He just knows who brought him up. And Merlin trained him and gave him advice. Is that pretty classic that Arthur doesn't know who he's descended from? He's still called Prince Arthur. So
yes.
He must be royal. And Una even mentions that.
So the stories of Arthur as kind of mystery child, there's a bit of it in Geoffrey of Monmouth, though the full story that everyone's familiar with the sword and the stone and the revelation of kingship, those are things that come up in the French source material that Mallory translates. So Mallory's the version that is known among English audiences since ever, really. So the short version is that Arthur is conceived by Uther Pendragon and Igraine, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, and Merlin foretelling that Uther is going to die very shortly after Arthur's birth, knowing that it would be unsafe for there to be an infant prince in a kingdom that's about to fall into chaos, preemptively hides the boy and even conceals his existence, so that Arthur is raised by a foster father. Sir Ector is what he's called in Mallory, and then at a later time, his lineage is revealed through the feat of withdrawing the sword from the stone. So in Canto 9, we have that same element of mystery boy who has been placed with a foster father, though in this version, the foster father is a fairy knight. So he is a knight of fairyland, and his name is Old Timon, who in youthly years hath been in warlike feats, the expertest man alive. It's a different name. It's not Sir Ector.
Is it the same character, do you think? Or he just has this ancient Greek name?
I really don't know. Spenser's doing his own thing. He has an ancient Greek name, but the name is related to the Greek word for honor.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I think here we're pursuing Spenser's allegory is kicking in now.
Yeah.
Arthur is raised by honor himself.
Yeah.
To live in an honorable way and to seek honor in arms. Arthur does know from Merlin that his father is a king, and that
So
one day
he
his
can justifiably claim the title prince.
yeah.
She's been called almost the whole time.
Exactly. So he knows that he's royal, and that's different from Mallory. I should say that I said that Mallory's the version that most people know. Well, I think
T.H. White.
T.H.
is the
White
one
through
that-
Disney is what
yeah.
most people know.
Wart.
Yeah.
Wart. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't get much almost no interiority for what pre-coronation Arthur is like in Geoffrey of Monmouth. Very, very little in Mallory. The most that you get from Mallory is Arthur's reaction when it is revealed that Sir Ector is not his father and that Sir Kay is not actually his brother. In Mallory, there's a moment of grief. And in response to the revelation, that's what Arthur first reacts to. It's not woohoo, I'm king. It's alas, the one I thought was my father is not.
So the Disney version somewhat captures that when he's all alone in the giant hall, the boy king that doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah, there's a sadness for a moment in Mallory that T.H. White catches on, and then Disney does too.
Yeah. And then Merlin shoots in from Bermuda. Yeah.
But
That's classic. Not to get, never mind. I'm not going to get sidetracked by Disney.
Well, Wart from Sword in the Stone is nothing like Prince Arthur and Spenser. Prince Arthur and Spenser, even long before he is king, he's a winner.
The main backstory here, all that, of course, is in the background, but the reason for Prince Arthur's quest, he was one of those very Shakespearean characters that swore off love and mocked his friends for falling in love. And then he's taking a nap outside and has a dream.
As you do.
Yeah. A vision that a beautiful maiden has laid down beside him. In stanza 14, she's announcing herself as the Queen of Fairies. He wakes up and sees that the grass is pressed down where she laid. And so he knows from that sign that someone was in fact there and his dream was true. That's his quest. He's been searching for her ever since. Arthur has a noble goal and he is seeing it through to the end. He understands the story he's in correctly. A huge contrast with what we're about to see from Red Cross.
Yeah. The allegory, the Queen of Fairies, is Gloriana. She's the quest giver in the Fairy Queen. Red Cross Knight came from her court. Una went to her court looking for a knight. So we know Gloriana, who represents glory, that right renown from honorable deeds. And so it is right that the knight who is raised by honor himself should seek as his bride glory herself.
You would think that they would just say to him, "We just came from her court. It's back that way. We know who you're talking about."
Yeah. We know her.
Yeah, but no, that would be too easy for this.
Yeah.
It's probably worth noting in stanza 19 for those C.S. Lewis fans, the knights exchange gifts. It's another example of that goodly golden chain from the first stanza. Prince Arthur gives Red Cross a diamond box that contains an ointment that can cure any wounds. And I believe this is the origin of Lucy's vial of healing liquid that she gets from Father Christmas.
That's cool.
And then Red Cross gives Arthur a copy of the New Testament.
I mean, it's a fancy copy. It's writ with golden letters, rich and brave, a work of wondrous grace.
And able souls to save.
Yeah. And so it's not just like the Gideon Bible he got at the hotel last night.
So it's kind of unclear. Is this the first? Is he evangelizing Arthur? I kind of got the impression that this is just like a fancy Bible.
Yeah, it's a treasure.
It's not meant to be a moment of the Knight of Holiness is now evangelizing the Knight of Honor.
Yeah.
That would be an odd thing to suddenly include in the middle of the book,
right.
I think.
Yeah, no. In the Middle Ages, books were enormously expensive, and especially a book that's illustrated throughout, illuminated is the proper term, as this one seems to be. That's the work of many craftsmen over many days and months. Many sheep died
Yeah.
for this. So you give an illuminated gospel to someone who knows and values it, not to someone who doesn't know it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I was actually just talking to my daughter about this yesterday, about how these manuscripts are often reminders of, it was an aid to memory for texts you already knew.
Yes.
So they weren't necessarily for people reading for the first time. It would be perfectly appropriate to give someone a copy of a book they had read already.
Yes.
And perhaps even more common. So I want to highlight stanza 20 because it does kind of set you up for what's about to happen. Arthur leaves, and then Una kind of glances over at Red Cross, and it says, but she now weighing the decayed plight and shrunken sinews of her chosen knight, would not a while her forward course pursue, nor bring him forth in face of dreadful fight, till he recovered had his former hue. For him to be yet weak and weary well she knew. So she obviously, don't forget, the ultimate goal for this knight is to go fight the dragon. Una perceives that he's in no condition to do that. We know that she's planning a rest stop for him before, that he's going to recover and get some training. But it's significant that he is in this vulnerable state. That's significant for the next adventure he has. That he's been through this pit, this trial, and then immediately, before he's recovered, he has to face this new trial. And the nature of the trial of despair is that it comes to you in moments of weakness, right? Moments when you're tempted to give up anyway. So they meet a knight who is fleeing. His horse is running so fast, it's like Pegasus flying through the air. He is dressed in armor, except he has no helmet. And he has a noose around his neck. And they stop him, Red Cross in particular. It's very reminiscent of the Cave of Error in Canto 1, where despite all the warnings that this knight says, don't go up there, there's this horrible villain up there. You can't face him. And Red Cross says, this guy has to be dealt with. And he strides up there.
I will do it.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Which it's good that I think it's really apt that you bring up the error encounter from Canto 1. There's a lot of mirroring going on, but this time there's some irony too. During Red Cross's fight with Error, he's losing for a bit, and Una cries out that he should add faith unto his force and be not faint. But then when it describes what he does, he has high disdain, and knitting all his force, he does what she asks. She says, add faith to your force. But that isn't what he does. He just adds more force to his force.
Right.
But now it's almost like Captain America in reverse. Having gone through Orgoglio's castle, he's now sort of pre-mad science Steve Rogers. All right.
Yes, he's the shriveled up one.
Yes, he's shrunken and puny. He doesn't have force anymore. And nothing he's done so far has built faith.
Right. Yeah, we haven't really seen a lot of progress from him. As we'll see in a minute, the experience of facing despair is yet another example of pride. So he was prideful in fighting Error. He was prideful in believing Archimago's images too quickly. He went to the House of Pride and sort of curried favor with the Queen. He was captured by Orgoglio. And then once again, we see him kind of fall victim to it. He hasn't learned humility yet, in other words.
He has been falsely inflated through most of the book by successes that didn't really matter. And so he's a bit like Orgoglio too. And like Orgoglio, he's deflated, but thanks to the grace of God, he doesn't cease to exist when he's deflated.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad we're sort of recapping Red Cross's journey up till this point. I think that's important because that's exactly what he does when talking to despair.
Let's get to that.
He recaps. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. I liked the setup here because Sir Trevisan tells him what despair's tactics are. He's going to talk to you. He's going to convince you to kill yourself. And Red Cross can't believe it. That's impossible. That someone could convince a person, a hale, hardy knight, to kill himself. And so he strides like, this isn't possible.
How could you
must
even
be
do
wrong.
that? That
You
is
must be wrong.
crazy.
It reminds me of Odysseus too, the tying himself to the mast to listen to the sirens.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, I can withstand this. I would
Right.
like to try, this danger.
Well, we've seen this with kids, just like, oh, it's a terrible smell. Here, you smell it.
Yes, exactly. So as a kind of, I'll give a little bit of the framework that I approached this episode in. I interpreted despair as almost an allegorist or a poet himself. He has an answer to, he's an allegorist in the sense that he has a straightforward interpretation of every event that has
Yes.
come. And he's full of images and parables too.
Mhm.
Crossing the stream, going home, which on your long journey, which is exactly what Spenser puts all of his knights on. He puts them
Yes.
all on these long journeys. Despair basically reframes all of Red Cross's adventures and, like someone writing an allegory, attaches significance to each of them. And my take on it was he misreads the story, but there's not really any way to argue with it while you're operating inside the story, because Red Cross he's not acting like a holy character. So if you just look at the story within itself, you see, well, yeah, he does deserve everything bad that's happening to him. I think we mentioned on the podcast, Stanley Fish's book, Surprised by Sin, which is a take on Milton's Paradise Lost. In that book, Fish, his argument is that Milton is he takes care to make you, the reader, identify with Adam and Eve in every respect, and identify with Satan even.
Yes.
So that when the judgment comes, you have actually you've identified sin in yourself because you identified with the bad guys. And then when the judgment comes, you are yourself condemned and are driven to repentance.
You are in some sense complicit because you have become sympathetic to their reasons for choosing wrongly.
Right, exactly. And it was the same. So I kind of adopted that and took it over here. As a reader of the poem, you want to, and we've spent, what is this now, 10 episodes, discussing and interpreting and talking about it. And at a certain point, that interpretation has to end. You can't just grasp everything about life. You can't allegorize or interpret everything in your life. If you do, the inescapable conclusion is that everything is bad. Despair cares very much about justice, or that's his argument anyway. We're all sinners and we deserve death. And if you look at each one of your actions, Red Cross, over the course of the poem, you will see that you've just sinned it's just one sin after another, and you deserve death, and that's all there is to it. So we talked about there was one book, I think it was Canto 6 perhaps, where we talked about how much like Proverbs it felt.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it was 6. Maybe it was episode 6. So each of the, I think it's the train of brides,
the sins.
Advisors, where the implication is like this pattern of behavior is going to lead to this outcome. This Canto, it almost takes that and turns it around and applies it back to you and says, so do you see where these things lead? You are actually sinful, and that's where this is the deserved judgment of sin. So Red Cross comes to that conclusion, and it's hard. It is weirdly hard not to buy into Despair's arguments. There's not a lot of internal fallacies to what he says.
Yeah.
The only answer is, but that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
You know?
You need to bring an element in from outside.
Right. And so the conclusion I came to was Spenser's almost exposing the limitations of his own craft. In the very beginning, we discussed what his aims were for the whole book. His goal was to fashion a gentleman through reading these stories.
Yes.
But at a certain point, reading the stories gets you into a dead end. And there's a lot of language used here that implies that Despair is himself a storyteller, a poet, an interpreter of stories. And look where he's ended up.
Right.
And so essentially, it's one of those interesting books that invites you, or actually almost requires you, to look outside the pages of the book for the satisfying ending. That's a pretty potent thing for a book to do, to say, no, the world contained in these pages is not the whole world. Despite the fact that this is an allegory about life, you can't just interpret everything in your life using this book.
in a funny kind of way, and this is a much diminished comparison, but in a funny kind of way, it's like the Phantom Toll Booth, in which a character goes through a long allegorical symbolic journey that's really meant to get him to read other books.
Yeah. Yeah.
To value learning, not in this story, but outside of this story.
Doesn't he leave his room? At the very beginning, Milo is very lackadaisical about life. He doesn't want to do anything.
Yeah, his room is full of books that he has no interest in.
Yeah.
And toys that he's bored with.
And he has to go on this whole journey. But that's, yeah, you're right. He doesn't, the story doesn't remain in the fantasy world. And when he comes out again, it's the real world that he turns his attention to.
He has a renewed interest in what's around him.
Right.
So in the same way, the Faerie Queene doesn't even pretend to give you everything.
Well, and I think it takes the Phantom Toll Booth one step further. In the sense that it doesn't just draw the character out of the fantasy world, where you, the reader, are like, oh, so the lesson is that you should stop pretending, and like pretending is fine as far as it goes, but you need to go and look out at the real world. Spenser is not telling you to do that. He is actually bringing you to a point in the story where it's almost like the book has he's just reached out of the book and said, no, you need to shut this book and go outside. It's so in the Phantom Toll Booth, Milo is doing that, and you're watching him and going, good choice, Milo. But I think in the Faerie Queene, because of the nature of sin and how connected it is to us, and the fact that despair uses all of the same strategies that a poet uses, retelling the story with certain conclusions, and they're really kind of inescapable. It's not until Grace rushes in from outside that you get the freedom, the escape. Yeah. And Grace doesn't rush in from outside in an allegory because it's a one-to-one match. Yeah. You know, you have this, you can't break the allegory by saying, and actually, envy doesn't always lead to this. So anyway, it was a very much a reader response C.S. Lewis type of thesis that was not in vogue when I was in grad school.
Well, there's two ways that Spenser could make the move that you're saying he needs to make. One is to break the fourth wall,
right?
Which is John Bunyan's choice.
Yes,
in Pilgrim's Progress, in which the narrative is flanked by cross references to the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like literally pointing you to the texts that it's being drawn from. That's breaking the fourth wall. The book is reaching out into the world and saying, hey, go read this book. In this case, the story's not breaking through the fourth wall. It's pulling the reader through the fourth wall.
Which is a very, I think, a masterful thing to do. What an incredible book that is able to do that. And we've mentioned a lot of times the pageantry, the invitation to survey and look at things. And one of the very unusual parts in book 3 is Britomart is in this castle full of tapestries.
Yes.
And Britomart does not pay attention to the tapestries. We, the reader, get a description of them, and we are the ones that interpret them. Mm-hmm. Where she is not our...
She's heedless.
She's heedless. She's not the character that we are looking with. You know, we're not looking through her eyes. We've mentioned this a couple of times where from stanza to stanza, Spenser jumps around with different narrative perspectives. Like the point of view from one stanza to another, like you may be looking at Sansloy's point of view.
Right.
What Una looks like from Sansloy's point of view. Mm-hmm. Then you may jump to the narrator interpreting what he just saw. Yeah. And then you may jump to some other character. And as a reader, you sometimes feel like you are walking through this world that Spenser's created, examining things for yourself.
Yes.
That the characters are sort of operating, like Britomart might be having her own adventure, but you stop in the room and look at things around that she doesn't notice.
Yeah.
She doesn't pay attention to. Yep. But you stop there for a second and look at what's on the walls. And so that's kind of it's like you and Red Cross are standing side by side here, and you're sort of looking at things through his eyes. But what the conclusion is that you have to get out of that. Like you have to get out of your own head, basically.
Right.
Which is kind of how I was taking this episode.
That's really cool because Spenser does give the reader, as you pointed out, Spenser does give the reader enough to see when the knight in question is going wrong. Every time Red Cross makes a misstep in book one, the reader knows it's
the
a misstep.
House of Pride.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, let's say that's in the label, or we know that's not really Una.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the stable boy
Right.
or whatever in Archimago's house. So we know the truth of it, but in this particular case, you know, we're tied to the mast, as you said earlier. We're tied to the mast with Red Cross Knight, and all we have is this spate of rhetoric, of images that both make death look sweet and life look unendurable, and then there's that turn where it's no longer death as escape from suffering, but death as penalty for crime.
Mm-hmm.
And then you become trapped in your own conscience.
Yes. And Christians throughout the centuries have identified this moment in the Christian life where you become aware of your sin to the point of desperation. There's multiple ways to react to this, but that process of introspection is something every Christian goes through at some point. Because you're so deeply aware of your sin, you have to read the whole Bible. You have to go to church. You have to experience and be told that your sins are forgiven, so that you see the whole story and don't just get lost in the little cycle that despair can draw you into.
In the Middle English poem Piers Plowman, there's a really cool scene in which the various sins, who are all kind of imagined in their sort of peasant medieval way, right? You get sloth in the form that it took in your village, right, in 14th century England, you know, and lust and gluttony. But they've all become suddenly struck in conscience, and they desire repentance because now they see what they deserve. And then Piers Plowman becomes the voice of the confessor, saying, don't despair, God has mercy.
On these allegoric, like,
Yes.
I am the figure of sloth. It would be like if Red Cross was able to convince the 6 advisors in the House of Pride to give up their sins.
Well, it's sort of the way the characters in Dante's Inferno, the way that the characters in Hell have each sort of become an image of the sin that they chose, and that they're part of their suffering in this depiction of Inferno is that they become ever more the image of the sin that they chose. And so what you have in Piers Plowman is almost the reversal. You have characters who have so chosen the sin that it's come to define them that they're just known by its name, but they're still alive.
Yeah, there's time for their stories to continue to change. Yeah.
You may look at your life and see it as nothing but gluttony, as nothing but wrath, but where there's life, there's hope.
Right.
And possibility of repentance.
So I suppose with our remaining time, we should probably get into the actual arguments. And this is exactly the trap I warned against just a minute ago, that it's not worth examining. But I think for the sake of our listeners, or perhaps single listener, that we should just kind of talk through what his arguments are.
Sure.
From the beginning, despair has the upper hand.
Yes.
In stanza 37, Red Cross strides up, mail glittering, sword in hand, and says, "Thou damned wight, the author of this fact," and that was one of the words I landed on in my close reading when I wrote my thesis. "The author of this fact, we here behold what justice can but judge against thee right, with thine own blood to price his blood here shed in sight." He points at the dead body of the man who just committed suicide, says, "Despair, you brought this about, and you're going to die for it." And Despair immediately responds, "What frantic fit," quoth he, "hath thus distraught thee, foolish man, so rash a doom to give?" Essentially, immediately doubting Red Cross's ability to pass judgment on this situation at all. He doesn't try to defend himself. He just questions his status as, like, who do you think you are bringing judgment into this situation?
Yeah.
You know, who made you judge over this? And then he goes on, "What justice ever other judgment taught, but he should die who merits not to live."
Yep.
Okay. Are you following me so far? You know, that's kind of he's taking him step by step through this. If he deserved to not live, he should die, right? The logical chain is unbroken so far. None else to death this man despairing drive, but his own guilty mind, deserving death. Is it unjust to give to each his due? Or let him die that loatheth living breath, or let him die at ease that liveth here aneath? So he chose to die. As we keep reading, Despair says he became aware of the sin in his life, the dark life he was leading, and concluded that his life should end, that it would be better to die now than continue piling up sin upon sin and darkness upon darkness. Are you going to bring judgment on that? Are you going to say, actually, no, you should continue living, piling sin upon sin and heaping judgment on your head? But I love how Despair, it just slithers right around the accusation.
Yeah.
This wasn't me.
His argument is all over the place.
It is, but it makes it really slippery.
I didn't stab him. He stabbed himself.
Yeah.
But then what he says that this man was despairing. Well, what's your name, man?
Right.
Like, he's got a name tag that says, "Hi, my name is Despair." He looks like Gollum. He lives in a
grad student.
Someone who's lived off of ramen and got scurvy.
Musing full sadly in his sullen mind, sitting on the ground, hair unwashed.
I always imagined Gollum, but he's got owls in the trees and hanged men all around him, and he's like, I have nothing to do with it.
Right.
It's the meme of the guy in the hot dog costume. We're all looking for who's responsible for this. Okay, Despair. But to say, I didn't stab him, he stabbed himself because of just judgment, but also as an escape. And that let him die at ease, that liveth here uneath, or in discomfort. And then he goes on to present this series of metaphors, each of which makes death the sweet release, the sweet relief after a life of suffering and pain and discomfort.
Right. Which Red Cross can't actually disagree with. And his response in stanza 41 is that it's not up to us to decide when to go to death. Because you can't, we still discuss death sometimes as rest, She is at peace,
Yes.
Your great aunt who died. She's now at peace. There's hymns about this stuff. So as a Christian, he can't argue that death is unrestful. But the main argument against suicide would be that you can't make that decision yourself. And Despair goes into this kind of predestination argument, it's this whole idea of fate in stanza 42, that basically whatever act is done on earth was foreordained.
And therefore is good.
Because God foreordains everything, right? So if you commit suicide right now, that was part of God's plan. And this is the hour of your death. Which again, he's just put you in this, that's a classic, foreknowledge of God dilemma. Does God, how much free will do we have? If you commit suicide, is that what God ordained? You drive your car off a cliff. Well, that's what God decided, how my life was going to end, which is true, but also you bear some responsibility.
Yes. His arguments are not consistent with one another.
No.
But they don't need to be. They just need to keep putting Red Cross Knight sort of back on his heels. Even as he's formulating an answer to one line of argument, another line of argument emerges, and what can he do? In the Air Force, when they're training fighter pilots, they talk about the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. See what's going on. Where are you in this situation? Decide what you should do next, and then do it. And that the way to win a fight as a fighter pilot is to get inside the other pilot's OODA loop. Act before they are done deciding.
Oh.
And so what Despair has done is he's gotten inside of Red Cross's OODA loop.
Yeah.
While Red Cross is trying to figure out how to answer his last argument, and then here's three more.
Right.
And weak Red Cross Knight is just overwhelmed. He had one tool that could have got him out of this, that beautifully illuminated Bible, and he gave it away.
That's a good point. I had not made that connection. That he just, his little the ointment that Arthur gave him is useless.
Yeah.
In this particular case,
yes.
he doesn't have a physical wound that can be
No.
healed. The main argument, I think, as despair proceeds, is that the longer you live, the worse things are going to get.
Yeah.
And then he goes
And the
into,
worse you will deserve.
and then he goes into detail about Red Cross's adventures up till this point.
That's fascinating.
And we cannot really disagree.
Mhm.
That every adventure Red Cross has had, he has failed in some way. And presumably, if we weren't people that read books and know that, things get worse before they get better, we would kind of come to the same conclusion and say, so far, you have done nothing that would lead us to believe that life is going to get better. If we just play this model out, if observable trends continue, things are just going to get worse for you. And it would be better. Yeah, it would be better for the story to end now. And yes, you're probably going to suffer pain in the afterlife, but it's nothing compared to what you would if you continued.
It's as if despair is a kind of perverse confessor.
Yeah.
He knows all of Red Cross's sins, and he's giving him the penance.
Mm-hmm.
And the penance is, well, take your pick, poison, knife, rope.
And I think in stanza 46, that one's the one that I think smarts the most because Una is standing right there.
Yeah, it makes his reference to Duessa.
Yes. And he's like, look, even this pure, beautiful maiden that you've pledged your service to, even she, you have been false to. Which I don't know that, I'm sure she knew already, but to just have to take that in while she's standing right there. And he's enamored with the speech in stanza 48. Mm-hmm. Red Cross is enamored with the speech. It's sweet to him. And this is where the pride comes in, I think. There's a element of despair where you know better than anyone. That's the temptation of despair, that I am interpreting life correctly. And the people that say, no, life's not as bad as that, are wrong. The people that say, no, you don't deserve this, what's happening to you, are wrong. Mm-hmm. I know better than anyone. I am the best interpreter of the life that I lead.
Yeah.
And I think there is a kind of sweetness to that, to sort of exult over others and say, well, you guys just don't get it.
Yeah. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen, says Red Cross Knight.
Right, exactly. So then we do have despair gets a little bit more active. He shows another one of those pageants, another picture to Red Cross of all and this was a fairly common image that medieval people in Spenser's day would have been familiar with, these displays of hell and damnation and what demons look like and what the mouth of hell looks like. And so he would have paraded all that in front of him without any hope. It's a frozen picture with no cross, no salvation. As we've mentioned multiple times, I think, throughout the story, it really takes Una rushing in from outside and basically just saying, you're an idiot.
Yes.
Like, you're supposed to be fighting a dragon right now. What are you doing?
You have a quest.
She calls him frail, feeble, fleshly wight. Nor devilish thoughts dismay thy constant sprite. In heavenly mercies hast thou not a part. Why shouldst thou then despair that chosen art? Basically, it's Luther's baptizatus sum. I am baptized. I have no other argument other than that. God chose me. And then they run away. They don't fight despair.
No. I mean, the proper, that is the proper response. The way that he fights is with words and with arguments, and despair must be transcended. At a certain point, this is an act of faith in grace, and both faith and grace are to a certain degree outside of the closed loop of human reason. To just sort of settle down in the grave with despair and try to talk yourself out of it, you're not going to.
Right.
But this is the same. I mean, it's not the same, but it's related to the sorts of advice that's often given when you're feeling despondent, when you're feeling depressed. Get out of your house, go somewhere, see people. You need to get out of the closed loop of your inward talk in order to find hope. And that's, I think, in a salvific way, that's what's needed. Humanity needs to get out of the closed loop of its self-talk in order to find salvation.
Right. And especially in the context of a poem.
Yes.
I mean, this poem begs to be interpreted.
Yes.
It's an allegory, right? Mm-hmm. And so the poem is almost suggesting that life itself can be interpreted. We talked about the book of Proverbs. There are these patterns and you can identify them. And life, like the House of Pride, is easily identifiable. But that's not everything. Like, you can't just sit here with the book. I can imagine a Christian worldview teacher who's approaching this book and says, all right, students, we're going to go through despair's arguments one by one, and we're going to write down refutations for all of them. And that is missing the whole point.
Yeah.
You get bogged down in that. That is not how progress is made. You have to, Rick Cross could have sat there and thought through all the arguments, but there's just too overwhelming for him. It's not the time for conversation. We obviously can't stop but without talking about how despair responds to their escape. He grabs his own noose, his halter, and hangs himself unbid, unblessed. I am assuming that he hasn't been baptized, I guess is what that means. But he can't die. He's done this 1,000 times, and he's just going to keep doing it eternally. He himself cannot attain the rest that he's been tempting other people to partake in. Maybe there's a level of envy to him too.
Yeah. And that's Spenser's sort of twist, that the whole time they had in some sense been in hell. And this is one of the creatures of hell stuck in a loop of embodying sin. Spenser's read Dante.
Yeah. Yeah. We are have to stop there, and there's lots more to talk about in the Canto. But I think that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening.